I think every historian who's been around since World War II has regarded it as one of the most important, if not the most important event of the last century. It's had enormous effects on the world and on the United States, and we're going to be talking about the effects it's had on the U.S., especially in this presentation. Now, maybe the biggest one is that it led to the Cold War, and we'll be looking at the Cold War as a separate topic in a good deal of detail. Just briefly, the world was now bipolar, separated into two dominant superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, also known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, shortened to USSR. All the same thing. Now, along with this, the United States now had a large military permanently. Earlier in American history, because of the protective effects of the oceans, we didn't really need to have a large standing army, in other words, a large permanent military. And for most of our history, we have not had a large navy. But ever since the war we have, because the world has gotten smaller, because of the advances in transportation, communication, the vast increases in international trade, and the competition with the Soviet Union. The world has gotten smaller, and we have had a large military establishment ever since. Also, we are now in the nuclear age. You can't uninvent the atomic bomb. Once we took that genie out of the bottle, we couldn't put it back in, and we will forever be living with the knowledge of how to create these incredibly destructive weapons. For several hundred years, going back to Columbus, the dominance of Europe was really strong. But World War II brought the end of European dominance and replaced it with dominance by, as I've said, the United States and the Soviet Union. And then, of course, in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. But what we have is a much more complicated situation today. Now, the end of the war also brought the United Nations. There had been a League of Nations after World War I, but the United States had refused to join it. The U.S. Senate had. But this time the United States did join this International Organization of Nations. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Along with our large military, we also now have a permanently large federal government. It's much more complex. It has a lot of duties that the federal government did not have before this. Some of that growth was a result of the Great Depression, which led to the New Deal, but some of it was a result of World War II and the effects of the Cold War. Now, we've talked about the Soviet Union. I want to just be clear on what the term means and how it's different from Russia. The Soviet Union is all of the colors that all of the nations or republics that you see in various colors on this map. Now the yellow is by far the largest. That is Russia. But the Soviet Union was actually made up of 15 separate republics. Countries like in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, of Ukraine, of Belarus, of Moldova, of the Transcaucasian republics of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and what are called the Central Asian republics. And you see the Kazakhstan, the Kazakh SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, in orange, south of Russia, and also the smaller Central Asian republics, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And all of those together create the 15 separate republics of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, the other 14 republics went their own way, and now it is proper once again to talk about Russia rather than the Soviet Union. That's been true since the end of 1991. Okay, so you will often hear me use the term Soviet Union, and then later in history I'll use the term Russia, and I want you to know the difference between the two and when it's proper to say one rather than the other. Okay, we mentioned the United Nations. Let's talk briefly about the structure of the United Nations. Its headquarters is in New York, in Manhattan, right on the East River, and you'll see the United Nations building in the top photo, and then inside that building you see the chamber of the United Nations General Assembly at the bottom there. Now, the United Nations has three main parts to its governance. The Secretariat is led by the Secretary General. That is a lot like the executive branch of the United States, except that it doesn't have the power of the presidency that the president has within the United States. The sort of lower house is called the General Assembly, and this is made up of one nation and with one vote each. But those nations don't really, and the General Assembly doesn't really have any real power. There is no way that the major powers in the world were going to give a lot of small powers the right to override what they wanted to see happen. So the General Assembly is really like a kind of debating society within the United Nations. The real power belongs in the Security Council. It includes 15 members, and 5 of them are permanent members. Now, what that means is that those 5 permanent members each have a veto over anything that the Security Council wants to do. And those 5 members are the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, Britain, France, and China. And anything of significance that the Security Council wants to do, such as intervening around the world, cannot happen unless all 5 of those countries agree, which certainly weakens the United Nations. But you can see why these nations wanted it that way. They didn't want to give up their sovereignty. They didn't want to give up their independence, so it was set up this way. And as I said, any one of these 5 can stop the UN from acting in a crisis. The UN has accomplished a lot of things, but it also has weaknesses, and you see one of them right here. Now, let's talk about the economic effects of World War II within the United States, and they're very, very significant. During the war, wages were very high. The federal government paid for war materials on what was called a cost-plus basis. They would pay companies their costs in manufacturing things plus a guaranteed profit. That's where the plus comes in. So companies didn't really have a big incentive to keep wages low because they wanted labor peace. They wanted workers to be satisfied with their salaries because they had to emphasize war production. They couldn't have interruptions. So hourly workers in companies did very well during the war. But with these high wages they were earning, they couldn't really spend that money on a lot of things. They couldn't buy houses very readily because new houses weren't being built. They couldn't, buy new cars. They weren't being made. And that was true of a lot of other goods as well. So people had money to spend and the desire to spend it, but nothing to buy with it. And that led to what is called pent-up demand. Think of like water building up in front of a dam with nowhere to go. And then when the floodgates are opened and the water is released, that's like the money pouring into the economy. And then people did buy houses, they did buy cars, and all sorts of other consumer goods. So the United States was very, very prosperous in the years after World War II. For the first year or two, there was a transition. There weren't a lot of jobs for the returning war veterans, but that didn't take long to correct. The production of consumer goods just skyrocketed beginning around 47, 48. Now, it was even a better situation for American workers and American companies because the countries that we think of as competitors today were still devastated by the war. Think of the major countries that compete with the United States today. Japan was bombed horribly. China was in the middle of a civil war and hadn't even begun the manufacturing revolution that we think of when we think of China today. Germany was absolutely devastated by the war. Korea, North and South, was occupied by the Japanese during the war. They didn't have any sort of economy that could compete with the United States. France was occupied by the Nazis for 4 years. Britain was bombed mercilessly by the Nazis. Italy was a scene of all kinds of fighting. And so basically the countries that we think of as competitors with the United States were not competitors then. So the result of that was that the United States enjoyed a huge dominance in manufacturing. Now that has changed in recent decades, but in that period after the war, there was an absolute economic boom. Now, union membership was at its highest in this period because they were able to negotiate contracts, and there was less of a gap between rich and poor than there had been earlier in the 20s, and certainly way less of a gap than there is today. The middle class was more prosperous, and this was generally a good time for the U.S. economy, and that prosperity lasted for roughly 25 years, up until the 1970s. Now, let me just give you some idea of the dimensions of this consumer boom. One of the areas where it boomed was in housing. The suburbs just grew enormously during this time. An example of this was Levittown, New York. It's a community built on Long Island, a few miles outside of New York City. And this was mass-produced housing. You can see these houses, long, long rows of housing that were pretty much produced the way Henry Ford built Model Ts. And you'll see a video soon that will give you some images of that. These were not lavish homes, but they were inexpensive, and what was called the GI Bill that we'll look at in a few minutes was perfect for this because it gave returning veterans, war veterans, low-cost home mortgages. So it was possible now for large numbers of people to become homeowners and to move into the middle class, because one of the most common characteristics of membership in the middle class is owning your own home. And millions of people were able to achieve that in the years following World War II. There was a tremendous boom in automobile production. When we get into the 1950s, you have what's sometimes called the car culture. Lots of new model changeovers, tail fins, and new designs, and different levels of car ownership that people could aspire to. It was a kind of a golden age of automobiles. things that had been around before but really took off during this period, things like refrigerators and washing machines. And soon, within a few years after the war, one of the most influential technologies in all of our history, and that would be televisions. Now, there were also demographic changes in World War II. Remember, demography is the study of changes in population. In general, cities grew, cities and metropolitan areas, a lot of suburban growth, and a lot of people moved to the coast, east and west, especially to the west coast, to California. A lot of sailors, for example, had gone through West Coast cities like Los Angeles on their way to war in the Pacific, and they liked it there. They liked the climate. They liked the proximity to the ocean. And when the war was over, a lot of them moved their families out to California. And it was so there was a boom there, and you see enormous growth in the population of California. You also see growth in a lot of other coastal cities. Along with that, there is a decline in the population of many rural areas, and there's a lot of migration from south to north. This is a process that had begun during the war, and it continued after the war. This would include both African Americans and whites moving from south to north. And along with this, there is what you could call the decline of regional differences. Accents that were unique to the north, to New England, to various parts of the country began to moderate a little bit. The differences weren't quite as dramatic. One reason is the influence of television, where there was more of a standard language being used for what was called broadcast English. Another reason was all the interchange of people that resulted from the war. A lot of members of the military had never been outside of their local areas before this, but now they were traveling not only all over the country, but all over the world, and they were interacting with lots of different other members of the military from other parts of the country. So you start to get a decline in those distinctive regional differences. Now, along with this, there were very important social effects of World War II. One of them was what's called the GI Bill. It was officially called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And it did two things. This was a massive federal program, and it's often regarded as maybe the most successful piece of social legislation in American history. It did two main things. It offered free college to anybody who had served in the military. You could go anywhere you wanted, and the federal government would pay for it. So the GI Bill has a major role in creating a larger middle class. Now, there were major changes for women as a result of the war also. During the war, many women worked in the defense industry, and after men came home from the war, a lot of them wanted to keep their jobs. They weren't always able to do that, but they had higher expectations. They wanted to remain in the world of work. That was many of them. Some of them, however, had had enough of that, and they wanted to go back to a more traditional life of living in the home, of being homemakers, of raising families. So there was sort of two directions that a lot of women took after the war. After the end of World War II, there was an enormous sense of confidence and pride after the war. You'll see this reflected in a video that you'll soon see. A lot of a sense that the U.S. was on top of the world. At the same time, a lot of people just yearned to live normal lives. Look at what they had been through in the last 15 years. The country had undergone basically a decade of depression, of terrible deprivation, and a half a decade of war. And they were done. They wanted to live normal lives. They wanted the backyard barbecues and the Little League baseball games and things like that. And what their children, the baby boomers, would normally think of as boring, they thought of as just wonderful. And that brings us to one of the major social effects of World War II, and that was the baby boom. When so many men had been separated from their wives for so long, when they came back, they really were ready to start a family. The increase in the population was dramatic. And we still see the effects today of this whole generation known as the baby boomers. Now, minorities also were significantly affected by World War II. When veterans came home, I'm thinking of African Americans especially, they expected a better life, but the reality that they encountered did not always match up to that. In fact, it usually did not. In the South, you had segregation. Segregation by law, that's what de jure means, where they still had Jim Crow. And even though they had sacrificed and many of their friends had given their lives for their country, they were treated like dirt when they came back to the South. And they resented that, as you might expect they would. In the North, there was segregation also, but it wasn't by law, it was just in fact, and we still have a whole lot of that today. That's called de facto segregation. Now, the number of Hispanics doubled. A lot of them had come into the country doing farm work to keep the country supplied with food, while so many farmers were away at the war. There was also a lot of opposition to segregation. And Harry Truman tried to get a civil rights bill through Congress, and he couldn't do it because Southern members of Congress, especially Southern Democrats from his party, opposed it and refused to budge an inch on civil rights. So President Truman said, well, look, there are things I can do in my capacity as the President and Commander-in-Chief that Congress doesn't have anything to say about. And since I'm Commander-in-Chief of the military, I can end racial segregation in the military. So he did that by executive order in 1948. But all during the war, there were segregated units in the U.S. Armed Forces. He also ended segregation in the federal government among federal workers. And with all of this, it's part of the background for the civil rights movement. This is not a direct, simple cause and effect situation, but this is laying the groundwork for a major series of social changes that would happen begin in the 1950s and lasting for about a decade until the mid-1960s. And that would be the civil rights movement, which we'll look at in some detail as a separate topic.